This conference will now be recorded.
Great. The Clatsup County Planning Commission meeting on Tuesday, January 11th, 2022 will come to order. Would staff please take the roll?
Okay. Nadia Gardner.
Present.
John Orr, who I can see is on the screen. Lum Kwong.
Here we go. I'm here.
Okay.
Excuse me.
All right, Chris Farrar.
Present.
And Carrie Johnson is absent.
I'd like to welcome the public. It looks like we have David Cook and Lindsay Davis present. The Planning Commission is the official venue for public involvement in planning and community development for Clatsop County. We thank you for your interest and involvement, and we always welcome your thoughts by email or verbal public comments. We'll move on now to the agenda. I'll take a motion in a second to adopt the agenda as presented or any suggested amendments.
I move that we adopt the agenda as presented.
I second.
Thank you. We have a motion from Commissioner Farrar and a second from Commissioner Orr. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed, please say no. The motion passes unanimously. Next, we'll do the business from the public. This is an opportunity for anyone to give a brief presentation about any land use planning issue or county concern that's not on the agenda in the public hearing form. Those public hearings do give opportunity for public comment, but non-hearings do not. So this is the time if you have comments on pretty much anything on our agenda today. All speakers from the floor are to state their name and address before speaking. And if you're appearing in a representative capacity, please identify who you are representing. Do we have anyone who wishes to speak today? Hearing none, we'll move on to the minutes. So for the minutes of December the 14th, 2021, those are the regular Planning Commission meeting minutes. Does anyone have any corrections? Hearing none, the minutes can be approved as presented. Last chance. All right, we'll consider the minutes approved by consensus then. I wanted to just note Director Henriksen pointed out that David Cook is a planner in community development. Thank you, David. I'm glad that you're here. So we'll move on to public hearings. And the intention historically was to look at the comprehensive plan goals 7, 9, and 13, but we're presented with a request to continue those public hearings to the February 8th, 2022 meeting. Will staff please make their report?
Yes, these goals were supposed to be reviewed on, Goal 13 was supposed to have a review completed on November 23rd by the Joint Planning Commission, countywide CAC, and then goals 7 and 9 were also supposed to be completed at the December 28th meeting. Due to the committee did not get through all of goal 13 in November, so that was continued to December 28th. And then at the December 28th meeting, there was not a quorum of members present, so the meeting was rescheduled to January 7th, which was last Friday. And because our Planning Commission agenda is due out on January 4th, a week before the meeting, we were not able to meet the timeline because the committee members were not able to hold a meeting. So we had already submitted the advertisement to the paper, and given that there may be an expectation among the public that these goals would be discussed today, we are requesting that they be formally continued to the February 8th Planning Commission meeting.
Thank you, Director Hendrickson. Any questions or discussion from the planning commissioners?
Do we need a quorum for making this decision?
Yes, according to your bylaws, 4 members are required for a quorum.
So we have a quorum today with Commissioner Kwong or Farrar and myself.
Sorry, I guess I'm having trouble counting up to 4 this morning.
I have a question. When are we going to get some more planning commission members? It seems like the situation is approaching the critical.
You'll be
on the agenda.
discussing that with your board at your joint meeting on January 19th.
Thank you. January 19th.
Okay.
Well, without further ado, I'll move to continue the public meeting for considering comprehensive plan goals 7, 9, and 13 to the regular February 8th Planning Commission meeting.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Commissioner Kwong seconds, and Commissioner Farrar has made the motion to continue the public hearings for goals 7, 9, and 13 to the February 8th, 2022 meeting. Any discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
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 All those opposed, please say nay. The motion passes unanimously. All right, we'll move on to the meat of the meeting, the work session, discussion of House Bill 3012 and Senate Bill 391 addressing accessory dwelling units on rural residential lands. Would staff please make their report? And I'll point out to the group that there's great materials in the packet. The link doesn't quite line up with the beginning of the staff report, which is on page 6 of the packet. Or page.
I apologize for that error. I had to put the agenda out myself, so that is completely on me. Yet again, thank you for pointing out my mistakes. I appreciate that.
Oh, no,
We
no problem.
we always strive to do better.
Yeah,
okay, so
40
we're here today to talk about House Bill 3012 and Senate Bill 391, which both deal with accessory dwelling units on rural residential lands. And the reason that we're going to talk about this today is, first of all, to provide you with a little bit of background, to talk about whether or not the county should implement the provisions of either of these bills, because they are not mandatory. The counties can choose to implement them or not. And then also, if we want to move forward with recommendations on any changes to our zoning code that might be required if the county does want to implement those provisions. So just as a little background, we do allow accessory dwelling units in the county right now, but they're only allowed on lands that are designated in our comp plan as development and in areas that are served by a public sanitary sewer system. So those 4 zones where we do allow accessory dwelling units are the Arch Cape Rural Community Residential, the Napa Swenson Rural Community Residential, our Rural Community Multifamily Residential, and then our General Rural Community Residential. And in all of those zones, accessory dwelling units are permitted as a type 1 use, which means that they go through a development permit process, but there is no public notice and no public hearing for those uses. Okay, so when we look at where we currently permit accessory dwelling units, we do have a set of requirements that go along with that. You can only put an accessory dwelling unit on a parcel that already has an existing single family home. You can only have one ADU per parcel. If you live in or own a duplex or a multifamily dwelling, accessory dwelling units are not permitted, only with a single family home. You have to meet, obviously, your maximum lot coverage restrictions and any setback requirements that are in place. And with an ADU, it can either be a separate structure that stands alone by itself or something that's either attached to or within the primary dwelling. We have some size limitations in terms of how big an accessory dwelling unit can be, and that's limited to either 75% of the gross habitable floor area of the main house or 900 square feet, whichever is less. If you do have an ADU that's attached to the main house, you can only have one front door, and the reason for that is typically because if you are in a single family neighborhood, you want to maintain that character of the neighborhood. And so by having just the one front door, that continues to maintain that single family residential character. And then we also do require that accessory dwelling units be constructed with materials that are similar with regard to architectural design or color to those of the primary dwelling. So I'm going to pause there, see if there's any questions before we move on.
Are there any questions from the group? I have one. If it looks like Commissioner Orr might have a question.
Yes. I don't know if, okay, so my question is on the front door facing, I guess that was it, the front door requirement that you just addressed. And I'm wondering if the idea is to supplement housing that we might better do that by allowing a separate entrance to an ADU to supply additional housing for non-family, for example, situations in the ADU. That's, I think that's worthy of some consideration. There's the aesthetics, and then there's the practicality. Thank you.
Yes, and to clarify, you could do a separate entrance on the rear of the building. It's just the prohibition only exists on adding a second door to the front of the building.
Oh, that's a great clarification. I saw somewhere, so do you have to be on sewer currently to have an ADU?
Yes,
Okay.
you do.
So where in unincorporated Clatsop County is there commercial sewer? So Archcape has one, but where else?
Westport has commercial sewer. Miles Crossing, Jeffers Garden area.
What about Svensson Napa? Because isn't that where they're allowed? So they're allowed there, but there's no commercial sewer, so they're not allowed really?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I pulled that from the zoning code, but I am not aware of a sewer district out there.
So though theoretically they could be there, they can't actually because of that other restriction. Okay. So Westport, Napa, it'd be interesting to know just the history of that, why that one. And so rural community multifamily residential and rural community residential, do those line up with the zoning in Westport and, the places you mentioned, sorry, yeah, Westport and Napa Svensson, I'm sorry, not Napa Svensson, Jeffers Garden, Miles.
Yeah. Yes, they do.
Oh, they do, okay. So those ones make sense for those areas, but the Napa Svensson is the one that's kind of doesn't line up, okay. Other questions before she moves on? Huang.
Yes, I have a general question. What is the idea of allowing ADU to be built? Is this to alleviate housing at this juncture because of the demands?
Well, I think there's many reasons why you may want to permit accessory dwelling units in certain zones. Part of it is certainly to address housing issues and housing shortages, but also they're a good way for people starting out in the housing market to enter it, because the homes are typically smaller, may have less pricing with them. You may be able to rent them for a little bit less than you would a larger single family home. Also, if you wanted to have family members live on your property with you, but not necessarily in your house. Perhaps you want them there to take care of you as you start to age, or perhaps you already have medical issues that you know will be permanent. You may do it because you need to rent out the property to get extra income. I mean, there's several different reasons why someone might want an accessory dwelling unit. Currently, we do not have prohibitions against using them as a short-term rental, but if you did that, then you could not rent out the main house. You'd have to make a choice which one you wanted to rent out.
Right. Yeah, I guess I'm just thinking of more in the general population that don't have housing. There's I guess there's a large need for it, and I guess this is a good first step, but we have such a huge shortage that I don't know what the next step might be, because I know that there's a good reason why the code has to be met, and for sanitation purposes and all that, but the prices of these units is, and the building material is so high that I can't imagine that who can really afford to rent these units.
Thank you, Commissioner Kwong. I want to point out to the group this beautiful report that was done in 2019, the Clatsup County Housing Strategies Report. There's a summary report and then there's the full report. And it talks about all the different tools in the toolbox to address affordable housing, workforce housing in our county. And it gives specific things for cities to do, and then it gives specific things for the county to do. And the county's role is more limited because, well, 85% of our county is in industrial timber, and that is a resource zone that housing is restricted from. And then, there's just the kind of more rural challenges with developing housing. So this is one way that we could consider adding some workforce housing. And as you said, something that's 600 or 900 square feet is not family housing necessarily, but it's workforce housing. I myself lived in a 600 square foot cottage for several years before buying our house in Arch Cape and starting a family. And I'll say, it was $500 a month, 20 years ago, and now it's $1,400 if you can even get anything. And so this is kind of replacing some of that, kind of entry level housing for especially our younger workers and single workers in the county and cities. But and I also just wanted to point out, I feel like there's a lot of misconceptions about what an ADU is. And as someone who grew up in Portland that has family there, I know a lot about ADUs, and I think a really important point about them is that they don't, it's actually quite a bit cheaper to develop an ADU within your house, not to make a separate house on your property, but actually to develop something off the side or replace the garage or put something in the basement if you have one, because you can share plumbing and electrical and stuff like that. If you put it in your backyard, it's actually quite a lot more expensive to do. And just driving around in Astoria yesterday, I noticed just some really beautiful spaces, like in daylight basements throughout the city already. And so anyway, I just wanted to kind of point out those couple things. I would really like to hear more about the distinction between ADUs and guest houses. I expect, though, that you'll get into that, Director Henriksen. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, I think Commissioner Farrar has something else, another question before we move on.
I have a question related to your point you just brought up about the distinction between ADUs and guest houses. But I also would like a distinction between what might serve as an ADU, but when do you have to call it an ADU? If you had a sizable house, maybe 2,500 square feet, and divided it up to where you could invite one or two people to live in part of that house, maybe even have another kitchen for them. When does just having more people living in one abode become a principal residence and an ADU? What's the distinction?
The primary distinction would be the kitchen. So with a single family home, you're allowed to have one kitchen. With an accessory dwelling unit, you can have a kitchen. With a guest house, you cannot have a kitchen. So that would be the main threshold that we would look at to determine whether something is an accessory dwelling unit or a guest house. Does it have a kitchen or does it not?
Commissioner Farrar.
You may have, Director Henriksen, you may have already stated this and I missed it. In these rural community classifications, Arch Cape and Westport and Jeffers Garden, where potentially you can have ADUs, is there a lot size limitation as there are for the other zones that you'll be talking about on rural lands?
There are lot size limitations, and I believe all of our zones except maybe lake and wetland and a few of the resource zones. But all of these development zones listed on the screen and the rural residential lands do have minimum required lot sizes.
But what I mean is for the RA1, RA2, RA5, and some of those other zones, it looks like there's a 2-acre minimum required. Is there an acreage minimum, or is it just lot coverage percentage that would apply to Westport area and Jeffers Garden and Arch Cape?
So in the development zones that we're talking about that have the sanitary sewer, these zoning districts do have minimum required lot sizes if you're creating a new parcel or a lot in that area. But when it comes to the accessory dwelling unit, there's not a minimum lot size requirement that you have to have in order to put an accessory dwelling unit on your property. Is that the question that you're asking? I'm not sure I understand your question, sir.
I think you're answering it. Maybe you could just talk a little bit. Is this primarily related to the sewer issue, and a small property might not be able to support an individual septic system, or the density of septic systems might be too great for a neighborhood if the lot sizes weren't large? Is that basically what we're looking at here?
So again, I'm not sure if I'm going to answer your question, but when we get to the part in the presentation where we start talking about ADUs on rural residential lands where there are not those sewer systems in place, then yes, you do need the larger size in order to accommodate not only the existing septic system, but if you're going to put in a new system to serve the accessory dwelling unit, and then you need to have replacement areas for those systems at such time in the future when they need to be replaced. So you would need a larger parcel in order to accommodate that level of development. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, I'll wait until you go through more of the presentation. I'm probably getting things a bit out of order here.
Sorry, just one more clarification point here. I'm sorry if I'm belaboring the point, but okay, so this slide says this is when where they're allowed, and then there's a point that says all are served by a sanitary sewer system, which is not true. But is it a requirement to have an ADU to be on commercial sanitary sewer? Yes, sanitary sewer.
Yes, at this point, you need to be on a sanitary sewer system. And
Okay.
so this was not a deliberate attempt to mislead you. I pulled information, and I may have pulled from a source that was incorrect because I used a different version of the code. Sorry, I'm trying to get back to my zone slide here. So it was not an attempt to deliberately lie or mislead the Planning Commission. I just want to be very clear about that. But if you were to ignore Napa Swenson, all of the others are on sewer, and our code specifically states that you do need to be on a sewer system.
I actually think, isn't Falcon Cove rural community residential?
No, it is not.
It
They are
is not.
coastal
Okay, so
residential.
those ones, those zones are only in areas that have commercial except Napa. Okay. Well, so there's kind of two questions. One is there a sanitary district in the area in the zones? And then the other question is it required to build an ADU? So that's what's a little confusing to me. And I will say, like, so I just looked on the county website about where there's sewer districts, and it looks like there's two more Shoreline Sanitary District, which is based in Warrenton. So it might be some lands outside of Warrenton. And then Sundown Sanitary District, which is, that may be east because it's Bartolidis Loop. Is that east of Astoria? So anyway, I'm just pointing that out. So yeah, and of course, Director Henderson, no one is expecting you're misleading us on purpose. We're just trying to make sense of it. So
yeah, and so not every, just because you have a sanitary system doesn't mean you're automatically entitled to have ADUs. So there's not a correlation. But if you're going to have ADUs, the way the law has been structured in the past is you do have to have a sanitary system. But if you have a sanitary system, there's no requirement that the county allows you to have accessory dwelling units.
Thank you. All right, let's move on. And then I'm sure we'll have more discussion and questions as we move forward.
Okay. All right, so we talked about these requirements here that go with the accessory dwelling units, and you can, I think we've hit on all of those. So that's historically how and where accessory dwelling units in the county have been permitted. In rural lands in Clatsup County, we have not allowed accessory dwelling units, and a big part of that has been the sanitary sewer requirement. And so when we talk about rural lands, I want to make sure that we all understand and that we're talking about the same type of zoning districts and areas. So in the county, there are basically, to overly simplify, three types of lands. There are lands that are inside urban growth boundaries. There are lands that are in resource zones, which are your farm and forest zones. And then you've got the other, which are rural lands that are outside an urban growth boundary, but are not farm and forest. And so in our county, we have 7 different zoning districts that are considered rural residential zones. One would be the coastal residential, which is the Cove Beach area. We have coastal beach residential, which is further north up in the Clatsop Plains area. And then we've got our residential agriculture zones, RA1, RA2, RA5, and RA10. Our RA10 zone exists on the books. It's in our zoning code, but we have never applied that designation to a single parcel within the county. And then the final zone would be the single family residential. And I've listed on here the number of parcels that GIS has calculated is in each of those zoning districts. So in theory, there are over 6,000 of these parcels within the county. That does not mean that every single one of them is going to be eligible for an accessory dwelling unit, or that every single one of them would build an accessory dwelling unit. But that gives you an idea of what the maximum is that theoretically the county could be looking at. So we had some discussion earlier about minimum required parcel sizes, and some of them do vary depending upon whether you're in an area where the county has taken an exception to one of the statewide planning goals, or whether you're outside that area. So for example, down in Cove Beach, where we've taken an exception to goal 4 or 3 and 4, we have a reduced lot size of 20,000 square feet. But if you are outside that area where we've taken that goal exception, you have a minimum size requirement for your parcel of 2 acres. And I won't go through all of these. I know you can all read, but they vary generally between 1 acre all the way up to 10 acres, with the exception of the Cove Beach area. So I will pause here, see if there's any questions right at this point.
Commissioner Farrar.
The roughly 6,000 properties that are identified here in this listing, are the ones we discussed previously, the ones in, I forget the terminology very easily, but the rural community areas that we were talking about, are that a different list of lots that would be available in those areas now? And if so, do we have a number of how many are available in those areas of Westport and Archcape and Jeffers Gardens?
Yeah, I do not have that information, Commissioner Farrar. We can certainly get that for you and send that out separately to the Planning Commission members.
So those are in addition to this 6,000, and I have no idea how many those are, but it seems as though we have, and I understand that, you know, a significant number of these properties listed here may not be allowable to have an ADU on it, but it does open up considerable possibilities for additional housing. And I think it's definitely something worth exploring.
Yeah, and just to be clear, in those zones that we talked about, Archcape and the others, we already do allow accessory dwelling units there. So that regulation has been on the books for several years. So I wanted to highlight where we already allow accessory dwelling units, but the primary purpose of our discussion today is to talk about some changes in state law that would now let the county, if we choose, to allow accessory dwelling units on rural lands. So we do already allow those ADUs in certain areas. So we wouldn't be necessarily adding anything to those areas because they would already be permitted if somebody wanted to build them.
Well, it's interesting that we have that situation available to us to kind of look and see, maybe in a way, how likely it is ADUs get developed on properties. You know, using it as a model. I know it's more complicated than that, but that's an interesting point to me. I have one kind of nitpicky question, and I remember you telling us the reason for it possibly years ago. Why RA1 in our county seems to have a minimum size of 2 acres, where the 1 is typically thought to be a 1 acre, you know, rural agricultural land with 1 acre, and then RA2 with 2 acres and so on. But can you just briefly explain how that came about? It's confusing to me a little bit.
Yeah, so originally the RA1 was a 1 acre minimum parcel size. And then sometime, I want to say maybe around 2000, there was a case that either went to the courts and or LUBA. Don't remember the exact history, but the final determination of that case was that there was a 2 acre minimum required lot size on these rural residential lands. And so while the county changed that requirement in the RA1 zone, and the RA1 and the RA2 are almost identical in terms of setbacks, permitted uses, conditional uses, there are a couple of differences. And so sort of like our short-term rental ordinances, at the time, there just wasn't the desire to tackle combining them when these changes were made. So we kept the RA1, kept it called RA1, increased the lot size, and kept the RA2 separate. I think that as we move forward, when we finish our comp plan update process and we start getting into our zoning code and going through all the standards and requirements there, I think one of the things that I would recommend would be that we do combine those two zones just to make it a little bit easier for everybody to look at and understand.
Thank you.
All right, let's go ahead and move forward here.
Okay, so I have to remember where we left off. Okay, acreage. So there had been a question earlier as well about the difference between guest houses and accessory dwelling units. So an accessory dwelling unit is basically a mini house. It's got its own kitchen. It can be rented out on a payment basis. It can be used possibly for a short-term rental unit. If you've got a guest house, it's primarily intended for temporary housing for non-paying guests and visitors. And they have a smaller square footage limit. And again, no cooking facilities are allowed, and you cannot have a separate meter on the guest house. So unlike an ADU, which you may rent out to someone and want to have them charge their own separate utilities, with a guest house, it's really for when your mother-in-law or your cousins or your aunts and uncles come to visit and you don't want them in your house, but you want them close by, and you put them in the guest house for a couple of weeks. We do allow guest houses in all of these rural residential zones that we're talking about, the RA1, 2, 5, 10, coastal residential, and the other two. So that is the difference. Are there any questions about the differences between the two? Okay, so seeing none.
I actually just have a quick question. How do you enforce that? Like, like, how do you know that they have a guest house, and how do you make sure that they're not being short-term rented or long-term rented if you wanted to?
Yeah, so if you're going to build a guest house, you should be coming in to get a development permit and a building permit, just like you would any other structure in the county. In terms of whether or not they're renting it out and whether they're renting it for payment, that usually falls on code compliance. What will usually happen is we get a complaint from a neighbor who says they've got people living in the guest house, or the septic is failing because there's 20 people living on the property, something like that. And so we don't actively go out and follow up on every single guest house permit that we've issued on an annual or biannual basis. It's pretty much the honor system. And unless we receive a code complaint, we don't go investigate and follow up on these units.
Thank you.
Okay, so now that we have a little bit of background about accessory dwelling units and guest houses, I wanted to bring to the Planning Commission's attention some legislation that was passed at the state level that
I'm
would
sorry.
allow.
I'm sorry. I was a little slow on getting the unmute to work, so I apologize for interrupting you, Gail. But that caught my eye, the honor system as a vehicle for enforcing proposed modifications of the code in advance of the affordable housing or workforce housing, however you call it. And I have grave concerns based on what is, I guess, just anecdotal evidence and maybe some reports and controversies in Gearhart. And so I would say that should be kept in mind, because you can have this really good legislation, we can have good intentions, and yet because of the profit motive and because of the lack of honor in modern society, it just goes to people who can afford vacation stays and people who want, vacation rentals and short-term rentals. So I think we all need to keep that in mind. I certainly do. I have guarded feelings about this well-intentioned effort. I don't know what other options we have, but that's all I have on that.
Thank you, Commissioner Orr. Okay, so going back to the state legislation, we originally intended today to just focus on Senate Bill 391, but in the process of preparing the background materials, we also came across House Bill 3012, which was adopted in 2017. And it looks, so let me back that up. So the bill was adopted in 2017. It was an optional bill for the counties if they wanted to allow accessory dwelling units on rural residential land, and it had a very limited scope. The bill basically says that if you have an existing home on the property that was built between 1850 and 1945, what's considered to be a historic home, then if you build a new home on the property, you can convert your historic home to an accessory dwelling unit. And there are some standards that are in the legislation, such as minimum lot size of 2 acres, not being able to separate the parcel in the future, so you separate the ADU and the new home. You cannot replace the ADU if it's lost to fire, which is very specific. So if it's lost in a windstorm, that's okay, but if the house burns down, you cannot replace it. So it seems that the county never took up this option when this legislation was passed. And so we wanted to include that today in our discussion of rural residential ADUs. And you'll see in your cover memo that's in your packet that Table 1 discusses some of the items that we would need to talk about as a planning commission and then at the Board of Commissioners level, because there would probably be some code provisions, there's probably some policy questions involved in this. And so what I would like to do is just go through my presentation and then have the Planning Commission kind of work your way through these tables, if that's in agreement with everybody today.
Director Hendrickson, just to be clear, so House Bill 3012 allowed counties to do this, but didn't require them to.
Correct.
Correct. Yeah. So if we chose to as a county, it's now an option.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so that's one piece of our rural ADU puzzle. Yeah, so we talked about this and we never adopted it into our code, and then we'll come back to our memo and our policy and revision questions. But then I also want to spend some time talking about Senate Bill 391, which was adopted just last year. And in many ways, it has a lot of the same provisions that we see in House Bill 3012, but it doesn't rely solely on that existing historic home provision. Senate Bill 391 is also very closely linked with Senate Bill 762, and that deals with the wildland urban interface primarily, and two things that came out of Senate Bill 762 that are on which Senate Bill 391 relies are two things. There's a revised definition of the wildland urban interface, and then there's a requirement that wildfire risk maps be developed. And until those two things are done, counties are not able to fully implement everything in Senate Bill 391. And we're bringing this to you now because we want to be in a place where when those items are done, we're able to go ahead and move forward very quickly. So the definition for the wildland urban interface has been revised. There were two rulemaking committees set up, one to deal with the definition, one to deal with the mapping. And that definition basically says that a wildland urban interface is a geographical area where structures and other human development meets or intermingles with wildland or vegetative fuels. So that is our definition. And based on that, the Department of Forestry is working on developing the wildfire risk maps that are supposed to be completed by the end of June of this year. And the wildfire risk maps are important not only because they're going to tell us where the high risk of wildfire is, but the rules for accessory dwelling units will change slightly depending on whether or not you're in that wildland urban interface or whether you're outside of it. And we'll talk more about that when we go through table 2 in a few minutes. So I'm going to pause there. Any questions so far?
Commissioner Farrar?
Given that SB 391 is now been adopted, maybe it's not really too important about going back to HB 312, but I was uncertain as to why there was age limit on the home set for having an ADU. I didn't understand why that was even incorporated in there. Why couldn't somebody that had a home built in the 1970s or 80s also be allowed to have an ADU? Can you comment on that at all? Just for my own edification here.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question. That bill was adopted before I came into this position, so I wasn't even familiar with it until last week when I first ran across it. If I had to suspect, I would speculate that it probably was tied to the desire to save a historic home or an older home, but still allow people the opportunity to be able to upgrade without actually having to tear down the historic building and replace it. That's what I suspect, but I don't know that with any certainty.
Okay, that does make some sense. Thank you. That clarifies it for me.
Looks like we can move on.
All right, so again, if we want to move forward with implementing Senate Bill 391, there's a long list of policy and standard recommendations that we will need to discuss, and that's in table 2 of our cover memo. And then in addition to that, one thing that we need to think about, which is not spelled out in any of the legislation, but if we're going to allow accessory dwelling units, we know that in our development zones, they're a type 1 permit. No public hearing, no public notice, over-the-counter development permit, as long as you meet the clear and objective standards that are outlined in the code. Other options would include elevating these to either a type 2 conditional use, which would require public notice but no public hearing, or a type 2A, which requires public notice, published notice, a sign on the property, and a public hearing. One thing that we should all keep in mind is that as we go higher up the approval chain from a type 1 to a type 2A, it also increases time for an applicant and increases costs and processing fees for the applicants as well. So for our focus is on affordable housing and making the process as simple and efficient as possible, then we want to think carefully about what type of review that we want these types of accessory dwelling units to go through. As we work through this with the Planning Commission and you make your recommendations, we would bring those forward to the Board of Commissioners for review in the future. We've not set a date for their work session, but we're in their parking lot of things to talk about. And then we, based on what the board direction is during that work session or work sessions, then staff would prepare the amendments for our zoning code and bring those back to you as the Planning Commission for review, and then a formal recommendation back to the Board of Commissioners. And so that concludes my presentation. And are there any additional questions right now?
I'm just going to speak up really quickly and just say I was looking at the work session agenda for tomorrow for the County Commission, and they're doing their legislative priorities for 2022, working with their consultant PacWest. And I noticed that under infrastructure, they have, as proposed, this is not finalized, I don't think, support accessory dwelling units in rural residential areas. So it's definitely being talked about in a positive way already up there. So. Okay, I see hands. I see Commissioner Orr and then Commissioner Farrar.
Yes, I alluded earlier to my concerns for enforcement and people acting in bad faith with regard to the ADUs and changes to liberalize approval of them. And so here we see the best solution that I can think of, and that is to make it a public hearing requirement, so neighbors are apprised and they're in the loop and they feel empowered. Against that, as Gail has said, that the cost and bother of getting them approved, the ADUs that is, uh, increases. And certainly don't want that to be an impediment, but as in many cases, this is a place where there's a balancing required. And at first blush, I believe the balancing of the public interest is best served by putting it through a public hearing process. It's not only because of the history of aggrieved neighbors with short-term rentals or unlawful use of ADUs as short-term rentals, it's also to ensure that a full examination of the other liabilities to the neighborhood and the community are scrutinized more fully and subject to public hearing, including wildfire, including resource lands, a proximity to resource lands. And so that's where I stand right now. I certainly keep an open mind to it, but I favor the fullest public scrutiny possible. Thanks.
Commissioner Farrar.
Well, I have another point I want to discuss, but I'll just say that I tend to agree with Commissioner Orr on that point. At least provisionally, there's some issues to consider on that. I don't know if anybody has the data or knowledge to be able to really put some dollars and cents on this. Just how much additional cost is it to build an ADU if you have to go through a type 2A, for example? I can't imagine that on a percentage basis that it compares with a very high number compared to the cost of labor and materials, but I'm willing to consider that aspect certainly. And also, one thought would be that if we go this route, maybe you could initially start out with a little higher standard, a little more scrutiny, and then later on revisit it and decide whether this is really a necessary function to and process to go through, and that maybe it can be streamlined. But initially, I'm in favor of that. I'd like to just go ahead with another general question I have. In applying either of these bills to our county, is it legally permissible that some sections of the county might allow for ADUs and other sections specifically still not allow them? What I'm interested in really is where would the ADUs do the most good? And when I map these things out in the county where the properties are, they cluster in certain areas. And so when I thought about it, I thought, well, you know, if there were ADUs on some of these properties, would the people living or occupying those, where would they be commuting to for work or school or services and so on? And I'm trying to get a bigger picture of how that if we distribute living out away from the actual cities in our county where there are a lot of services and commercial interests and jobs, you know, are we going to just have this flood of cars going back and forth between different areas, everybody living in one place but working somewhere else or going to school somewhere else? I'd like to consider that, you know, maybe there's a reason we should focus on allowing it in Westport. Maybe a lot of those people commute to the east and take jobs out there. I don't know. And But so the question really is that an option for us to pick and choose areas within the county? Again, maybe just starting out with some areas and waiting before we open it up countywide. Do you know what the legal constraints are on that, Director Henriksen?
Yeah, so since this is not a mandatory requirement, the county can pick and choose which zones it might be appropriate for and which it might not be.
Okay, thanks. Your answer was a lot shorter than my rambling question.
I guess I have a quick note on this. I don't really see the ADU as a sort of a density for housing. I just see this as more, it seems like more a luxury that people can afford to build these units here and there. I don't really see this as a density solver at all. Commissioner Farrar, you may be thinking like a high density apartment unit somewhere, but yeah, I think ADUs are very, one or two, maybe three people can live in these units, and I foresee this is fairly expensive to build. So I don't, for a very small amount of people, I can't imagine this would be a density issue at all.
Thank you, Commissioner, all the commissioners. I kind of want to take a step back here for a minute. So we're diving into adding potential locations for ADUs, but I feel like we as a county should always start at what we already allow and see if there's ways that we can refine or improve that first before jumping into expansion. And so, well, there's a couple of things. So, in my experience, in my following the issue in Portland, I'll say that Portland has a lot of ADUs, and it actually provides a lot. Well, it potentially was going to provide a lot of very, very needed housing. But they made the mistake of allowing them to be short-term rentals. And so if you give them an opportunity, you make more money from a short-term rental in a place like Portland, where everybody, especially during COVID, is flocking to short-term rentals over hotels. And so that gets gobbled up. So Portland has now fixed that. And in the last 2 years, if you build an ADU, you no longer can use it as a short-term rental. And so you have more housing, theoretically available because of that. And then I'll also point out that it used to be that you would rent one of these 1-bedroom or studio apartments or little cottages for $500 and $600. Now they're being rented for $1,000, $1,500, $1,600 a month. So they actually became, it is expensive to build them, but it also, you can pay back your loans. And I have several friends who are doing that in Portland now, both through short-term rentals, long-term rentals. And I'll say, you have like year-round rentals, but we also have a big need for housing for like traveling nurses and Coast Guard people, other people that come into the county. Maybe they're not coming in for the entire year, but they're coming for 3 months. So that's also very important housing. And those people often get paid really well, so they can afford things like this and look for stuff like this. So, so I just give those comments. And I'll also say that the thing that I think made it so successful in Portland was actually public-private partnerships, having organizations advocating for ADUs and also agencies really highlighting them as opportunities. I think nobody really knew what an ADU was in Portland 15 years ago. And now, they did tours and they did webinars, and they have consultants in Portland that just help you build one, a lot of them actually. And then they have ADU hotels actually, so there's all these different things that they did that made them very popular. And then financially they do pencil out. if you have the initial capital to get the loan to do it. Those are just a few things. So when I'm looking at our current rules, what I really like about our current rules is that they require sewer. I think that makes it a lot more easier to manage because you don't have to worry about septic and other lack of infrastructure issues. Unfortunately, I did get an email right when this packet came out from Charles Dice, and I asked him to come today and also provides comment, written comment if he couldn't, but he did not show up today. So I'll just tell you what he was concerned about. So Falcon Cove Beach doesn't have sanitary. They have a water district. Their water district is, we have comparative drought. So in the summertime, they're very low on water, and they're very quickly increasing the number of houses there. It's become a very hip place to build your vacation home, and there's lots of vacation rentals. And so he, as the water district person, is very concerned about adding density there. And then this sanitary issue, and then finally roads. So in a place like that where you don't have county roads, so if you add more density, there's more people driving in and out, and there's not necessarily more people helping to support that. I think they have some sort of a voluntary road pay-in system, but they really struggled with that over the years. And so that comes back to the public hearing question for me, is that I agree. I think at least to start, we should start with a conditional, I think that was a conditional 2A, but also we need to have accompanying criteria, because it's great to have people be able to come in and give their 2 cents, but if there's no criteria that backs up what they're saying, so for example, maybe there's a new criteria that says, it has to be in an area that is accessible by county roads or something, I don't know, that's just a made up one, but just addressing those specific needs to those communities, I think we need to really think carefully about that. In terms of making it easier to build ADUs in some areas, I think the design standards can go away. I don't really, especially in an area that's so eclectic. It's one thing if you're in Astoria or Cannon Beach where you have this particular aesthetic, but in the county, we don't have that very uniform look. And so I don't feel like it's important that an ADU looks exactly like the house that's next to it or a part of it. The one entrance thing, I don't know if that would make it easier to get rid of that, though I do appreciate what Director Henriksen said, that it's really just a restriction on the one on the front, but who cares if there's a second door in the front is what I think. Yeah, so those are some things that could loosen it up, but I feel like you could loosen it up, but you could also do, and we've talked about this before, it's been a couple years though, so maybe Commissioner Orr and Kwong were not on, but the county and its partners and the cities could be, sharing the good news of ADUs, encouraging them to be built in the current places that they're allowed. And I think that would increase housing just on its own before you jump into expansion, which I'm not closed-minded about, but I feel like, it makes sense to me to start with what we already have before expanding. And I'll echo what Commissioner Orr said, that I don't sit around and watchdog my neighbors, but I hear plenty of stories about guest houses and ADUs being rented out, both short-term and long-term. And so if we're not able and willing to truly enforce those restrictions, I don't know that we should be expanding what we're doing. That's enough for me for now. Thoughts on that initial part before I think we should just walk through the table, but I wanted, before we started walking through that future potential future changes to the adding it new places, I wanted to look back at what we currently have. So is any other commissioners or Director Henriksen, if you have a comment on what I have to say, I'm all ears.
I guess I have a question for the Planning Commission. If there's really not a desire to open up new areas for accessory dwelling units, but you would much you would prefer to focus on the standards we have in the places where they're already permitted, then we don't need to go through all the tables today, because that would be dealing with allowing accessory dwelling units on rural residential lands. If you only want to focus on where we have them now, staff can prepare a separate item and bring that back to you at a future date so that we could go through those existing standards in more detail, and you could make recommendations to refine them. But if the intent is not to really open up new areas for ADUs, then we probably don't need to spend our time going through the tables this morning.
Commissioner Farrar.
Well, I, for one, am very much in favor of exploring the idea of expanding the areas in the county where ADUs are allowable. And I say that for a number of reasons, but I'll go back first and say that in my wish to expand the area, I would be wanting to think about which areas and which areas not. And so a place like the southern part of the county that's pretty distant from a lot of the action anyway, a lot of the jobs are in Warrington and Astoria and places like that. I just don't think it's a great option for ADUs because you're just going to end up with a lot of people commuting if it's really used by workforce type people. It'd be far better to focus on the big, huge areas of RA 1, 2, and 5, etc., that are found up in the Warrington area and just east of Astoria and the Napa Swenson area. And that's where I'd like to see us really try to put things together. Where do people work? Where do they have to be during the day? And make sure that the place they sleep at night is reasonably close to that. So that's one thing. The other thing's more nebulous maybe, but I gotta say that I have this, and probably most people have, a certain level of concern about the fact that we have this huge urban rural divide, and it's at every level. It's certainly at a national level, it's certainly at a state level, and now it's even at a county level. And if you allow more people that in a sense are somewhat urban in that they have a job maybe in an urban area, but if they wind up living out in our sort of sub-rural areas like Napa, Swenson, you're spreading the population out a little bit more. If Clatsup County wants to avoid becoming a microcosm of what Oregon is now, where it's Portland and then there's the rest of the state, or Portland, Salem and the rest of the state, that's where we're headed if we keep throwing the higher density into places like Warrenton and Astoria. And I live in Astoria and I find it plenty dense already, and it causes plenty of problems. And I don't think it's fair of the county to take increased population and push it into those cities where then the residents of those cities are responsible for providing services to this expanded population. Let the population fill out along our main highway corridors, 101 and Highway 30. It'll be good for the county. It'll be good for us to mix it up a little bit and to increase the population in some of those areas that are destined to grow over time anyway. But we should be thoughtful in how we do it. So I really would like to step through these tables and look at it very carefully. I think we have to be very careful how we proceed, but this is a way to really open up some land in places that could be built on for housing.
Commissioner Orr?
At first, when Commissioner Farrar was speaking, I was a little concerned about where he was going, but when he mentioned corridor development, that is intelligent. That is intelligent planning, subject only, however, to the objective of, I think, modern planning. Thinking is that you want to have high density development in urban areas, both in congruence with the Oregon land use goals, and also for the efficiency and economic efficiency of infrastructure. So I'm thinking that South County would not really fall into that category for ADUs to facilitate shorter commutes, less road clogging, and less stress, perhaps, on expensive septic systems or sewer development systems. So I think that it may seem like the cities are getting more than they want or more than they need, or, God forbid, the quality of life declines further because of concentration. That is one of the primary objectives of modern planning theory and the Oregon planning goals as well, I believe. So they're good comments worth thinking, but it seems to me ADUs that feed into 101 and Highway 30 in proximity to Astoria, Warrenton, Seaside makes the most sense.
Commissioner Kwong, I saw your hand earlier.
Yeah, I agree with Commissioner Farrar and Commissioner Orr, but I don't think we can do it all today. I know I have to leave by noon, and I would like to come back to this as Director Hendrickson allows us to have this options of coming back to this. It sounds like a pretty involved details planning that we need to go to think further. Can we just go ahead and finish? Pardon me.
All right, what I'm hearing from Commissioner Kwong is that he'd like to move forward, and I'm hearing interest from the other commissioners to move forward to the table too. I'll just say, again, I'm not against exploring the expansion, but I would like to go back to the original, what's on the books now at a later date, Director Hendrickson, if the commissioners are supportive of that. So not just to look at expansion in rural residential, but also to look at how can we enable more housing development through the current rules on the books. And that's that to me is about not just about ordinance changes, but also about communication and outreach. I can't quite let Commissioner Farrar's comments go, though myself, like I am an Oregonian, I don't believe in sprawl. And to me, what he is encouraging goes against Oregon's land use laws or goals that we focus our development in city limits. Those are the most appropriate places and also cost a lot less when you put most housing in one place. The cities have more tax structure, more services than the county does, and also the county is very large. And so if we get people all the way down the highways and all throughout the rural areas, it's much, much more expensive to provide the services that we need for them in those disparate places. So I think there's plenty of opportunity in all of our cities to do multifamily and other housing without significantly altering the livability of those communities. So I continue to agree with the housing study, which said focus on the cities. And what was I going to say? One last thing. All right, I'm gonna leave it at that. So let's go ahead to go. Let's see. So what it says in the agenda is page 43, but it's actually page 9. So let's go ahead and just walk through it. So Director Hendrickson, I really appreciate how well this is organized. Thank you so much for this. It's a great way to kind of walk through all these opportunities and to give our feedback early on. So we're looking at Table 1, House Bill 3012. So this is the one that is the historic housing one. And we can think of it, you know, side by side with the next one, which is the more recent, that's not limited towards those historic housing. So should we just walk through the questions? Does that make sense? Should the county utilize the exceptions process to remove additional land from resource zones in order to provide more rural residential land for single family dwellings and accessory dwelling units? Commissioner Farrar.
Well, my answer to that was probably not needed right now. Looking at the number of potential properties that would already be included, you know, if we add, this is if we're adding RA1, 2, 5, etc. I don't think we have to look to. What was this question about? Trying to get exception of more F80 and AF land. I wouldn't see a need for that at all at this point in time.
Chair Gardner, you're on mute.
Thank you. Commissioners Kwong and Orr, do you have, are you in agreement with that, or do you have other questions or comments?
I don't at this point.
We don't hear you, Commissioner Orr. You're talking. Okay, I think he's in agreement. So I would agree that I think we
Yes,
have,
I'm in agreement. Yes, I'm in agreement that we can move on. I'm sorry, I'm having a lot of trouble with my laptop mute function, but yeah, I'm in agreement.
okay, so question answered. Should consideration be given to raising the eligible lot or parcel size for ADUs? Right now, it's a minimum. So if we were going to allow them in these different zones, it would be a minimum 2-acre lot size. And so this is keeping in mind that many of these would be on septic. Commissioner Farrar.
I think that 2 acres is probably sufficient. I think you have to look at it case by case. What are the soils there? But I don't think that the lot size needs to be larger than 2 acres to have an ADU on it. And well, if we're going to take these one at a time, I'll wait. But I could go on if you want me to say what I think about Clatsup Lane.
Sure, let's go on in those other 2 questions.
So I'll address the points for item number 2. And so the next one has to do with, should ADUs be prohibited on Clatsup Plains planning area due to existing and ongoing water quality concerns? I would say that that's a sensible idea until some more effort is put into working on this problem, which I think is in part of the strategic plan of the Board of Commissioners to look into this further. So it makes sense to take Clatsup Plains planning area out of that possibility for now and come back to it later. And then, are there other zones or geographic areas where ADUs should not be permitted? I had noted that I'm not in favor of increasing density in high hazard areas. So that includes some of the lowland places that are prone to tsunami risk and flooding. Also, if transportation routes are poor from those areas. That's why I focused more on the places around Warrenton and east of Astoria. I'd consider all traffic situation to try to minimize what's at times become really kind of intolerable in the summer around our county. And then places that totally lack services of kind of an immediate need, things like, you know, a small grocery store and fuel places and laundromats and things like that. Those are lower on the scale of developable for ADUs, in my opinion. That'll help alleviate the housing shortage.
Thank you. Commissioner Oren Kwong, any comments or questions around these three questions?
I do. Who are you calling on, Chair?
You go ahead, Commissioner Orr.
I go ahead and then Commissioner, or I go ahead, Commissioner Orr?
You go. Yeah, you go,
Oh.
Commissioner Orr. Sorry.
Okay, yeah, just call me Hugo. So my thinking is, and I speak from experience as a resident formerly on the Clatsup Plains near Adair Road, which is between Seaside and Warrenton, just south of the south end of Surf Pines and north by Delray Beach. So I guess maybe I don't need to overhammer the nail here that Clatsop Plains not only faces serious water quality, septic, septic issues, the water table contamination issues related thereto. Getting on the highway was terrible 10 years ago in the summer. And now, since then, since I moved out, we have more traffic. We have rush hour traffic, something approaching that. We have one route north to south on the coast. So it seems to me responsible planning dictates that we not put any more housing or vehicles on the road if we can control it, if we can help it, until we can figure that out, which might mean you place some where you can have more controlled access in Warrenton or Seaside or Astoria, but probably Seaside and Warrenton. I just see the Clatsop Plains and the traffic situation, the water situation, as one hot, unresolved, pass the buck situation planning wise. And I know that conflicts with people's ideas of their right to develop, but here we can control the beast, and I suggest that we do, and we do so by not allowing ADUs except maybe under extreme conditional use type of criteria, not extreme, but reasonable and appropriate conditional use criterion, that helps. Thanks.
Thank you. Commissioner Kwong, do you have any comments?
Well, I guess the big thing for me is like I don't know if I am qualified to speak on this because I don't know we have enough studies. I know that we do get a lot of traffic in the summertime, and how that affects our quality of life is it's pretty large, and I'm not exactly sure if adding more ADU units would really increase the traffic on this. I mean, I guess it's all really depends on where people want to build, of course. But yeah, I'm kind of I'm unsure at this moment on how I feel about it.
Thank you. So I think I'm in agreement with 2 acres, exclude Clatsop Plains, and then the hazard areas. I had been thinking about tsunami areas. It's a tricky one because, you know, we're allowing people to build all sorts of things in the tsunami zone, even hospitals now. You know, we're hoping that people will just magically move out, but it feels to me like if we're allowing other building, we shouldn't necessarily restrict ADUs in those zones, as much as I'd like less people to die. I want to go back to one comment that's been made about South County, and I will say, if you look at the affordable housing study, they will say that Seaside and Cannon Beach are both very high density and have especially Cannon Beach has very limited opportunity for increased density because everything's built out within their UGB. And they are expanding east of the highway, but it's limited by forest land and geological hazards. And so there is definitely a need for workforce housing in the areas outside. And I myself am an example of that. I rented in Cannon Beach, my little surf shack, until I wanted to buy, and I couldn't buy in Cannon Beach, for God's sakes. So I moved to Arch Cape, where I could afford something east of the highway in the woods. And it means I have to drive everywhere, which I hate because I'm a Portlander. I love biking everywhere and taking the bus everywhere. But that was my opportunity. And so I shop in Seaside and Cannon Beach and Manzanita. I think with the gig economy now, more and more of us get to work from home, which is great. But I historically did drive to Astoria 4 days a week. It was horrible. So anyway, I just want to acknowledge that there's certainly a need for housing, and that's acknowledged in the plan. Okay, let's move on here. I think some of these questions as you go down are the same. I would also, I'm sorry, Director Henriksen, go ahead.
Yeah, if I could just get a little bit of clarification. So on the second question about the Clatsup Plains, I know Commissioner Orr said that maybe it might be okay as a public hearing conditional use, the type 2A with certain conditions. I just want to make sure that the majority of you just think it should be excluded from Clatsop Plains. Is that correct?
It is for me, for now.
Yeah, I heard two exclusions, but I just want to make sure I've captured it. And then
it seems like it just needs to be a it seems like there's a bunch of study right now going into like what's going to happen. So maybe in 2 years we say, okay, now because that's been resolved, or now because that's not been resolved, we continue to not allow it.
Okay. All right. And then Commissioner Farrar, you had talked about excluding them from areas where there was not access to certain types of services. Is there a geographic limit or a numerical value you can put on that? If I have a grocery store within a quarter of a mile, is that acceptable? But if it's 10 miles, that's not acceptable. Can you quantify that?
Well, I'd probably steer away from quantifying, but I guess my overall approach is to try to find buildable properties that would allow the ADUs that would serve the resident of that unit the best in terms of having it a short commute to their job if they're a worker, or to the normal services that people use day to day, or if they have school-aged children and there's no bus service, or they want to take their children, those kinds of things. So I'd be looking for satellite properties around where the jobs are. And I think the county has, in that report, that housing report, I read it long ago now, but it seems to me that there are things about where people work. And if we focus on those and try to work outward from those zones where the jobs are, allowing more and more ADU development, in a concentric pattern around those. I know that's kind of complicated, but there are ideal properties for ADUs, and then there are less desirable ones in terms of being too far away and too far flung and lousy road access and all those things. And I just think we should encourage it in the properties that make it more of a smooth process of living. I know that's that's kind of nebulous, but
No, so instead of phrasing it in terms of being, not having certain amenities or access to certain services, can we talk about a distance from an urban growth boundary and setting an outside limit about how far you could be located from an existing urban growth boundary, as opposed to, I don't have a grocery store kind of near me, maybe?
yeah, I
Because
mean, in
we will
reality,
need to have criteria if we do go this route. We need to have some standards that are measurable. So just say how far are you from a grocery store? And nah, you're too far. You're 3.15 miles and you're 3.16. So you don't get an ADU, but the other person does. I mean, we need to have something kind of quantifiable that is clear and objective and that people can look at and say, okay, I'm clearly going to meet this requirement, or I'm clearly not.
That's a really interesting suggestion, Director Hendrickson, to do a distance from a UGB, because there are like little grocery stores scattered all over. But if our goal, Commissioner Farrar, is to minimize traffic and put housing near areas with worker need with jobs, then maybe we say 10 miles, 15 miles, 20 miles, and then that kind of keeps, at least it keeps the sprawl closer to town rather than like out in, outer 26, for example, way down, in between Astoria and Westport, if you actually, connect it to a city.
yeah, I get the idea of trying to quantify it, but a couple of things. One is that, in reality, hopefully people are generally inclined to do multiple things with their commute. They live in Napa, but they have a job in Warrenton. When they go to Warrenton, they don't just go to their job and then go home and then decide they need to go back to the grocery store in Astoria or something. So they composite these things, and maybe they drop somebody off on the way for some other test. But I think rather than miles and trying to get down that, because that could get really frustrating if you were just a tenth of a mile outside of what was allowed. I think if we had more like an overlay zone where we said, we the county have looked at this, and where it would really help in the housing crunch is if this overlay zone were to have more ADUs in it, and people could pick whichever property they want to put that ADU on within that overlay zone. And that overlay zone would be, it would be on the outskirts of Astoria and Warrenton and Seaside by some amount. But if you look at the map of where those properties are, as I did, and I'm looking at it here in my hand, but I can't show it to you. Well, maybe I could, but that's proof that I have it. There's clusters. You can draw circles around clusters of these things, and that's the way I would look at it. I'd just say everything within this overlay, we're promoting the idea, or we're opening it up to owners to consider an ADU on that property.
So I think these are options. And so this is just a discussion today. So I think maybe like if it is decided that we're going to do more work on this, staff could bring us back a couple different, knowing what our interests are, bring back a couple different options, and can really tell us what's feasible from a staff level, from a staff perspective. Does that make sense? Commissioner Orr.
Yeah. Over the years, I've read a lot of articles about the predicament of rural folks in the South and in the Great Plains, where they have food deserts and things like that. So that just seems like another reason for staying with the anti-sprawl proximity within an urban growth boundary. And more study is needed to see what trends are developing, or what are the real traffic traffic crunch points that would be related to a designation of an overlay zone and designation of distance from an urban growth boundary. Looking at development in connection with the urban growth boundary in Washington County, I don't know. Maybe that stays with the plan, but I just see huge amounts of absolutely irreplaceable rural lands, agricultural lands. Yeah, they're along the corridors, so that makes sense. But because we're going to have this friction, this tension between population density and preservation of resource lands, I think at some point down the road, with more study, we should keep it within, a reasonable distance. What that reasonable distance is, I do not know, but a reasonable distance might be 5 miles. And, the UGB maybe in conjunction with the criterion of a grocery store
It'd be interesting to know what other counties are
or a
doing.
gas station or grocery store and a gas station. Anyway.
Yeah. It'd be interesting to know what
Yeah.
what they're doing, like in Bend, for example, which I'm sure has kind of the same thing where you have this, high pressure to develop in the rural residential areas too. Okay, let's move on to historic house. So number 4. So SFD is single family dwelling. I kept forgetting that when I was reading this. Should a time frame be established to complete the conversion of the historic home to an ADU? If so, what would be the time frame? Director Hendrickson, can you give a little background on that?
Yeah, so Senate or House Bill 3012 says if you can build a new home on your property as long as you convert your old home, the historic home, to an accessory dwelling unit. But it doesn't give a time frame to do that. So I don't know. Typically, if you do some sort of replacement dwelling in a resource zone, there's a specific time frame by which you have to either remove or convert your old structure so that you are compliant with the code. And I was just wondering if there should be some sort of time frame to convert the ADU, convert the existing home to an ADU, or if it really doesn't matter because it's already a house anyway, and I don't know what you would need to do to convert your house to an ADU, except maybe hang a sign up that says I'm now an ADU, but
It does seem like a loophole to me, like someone will do it, build another house. So it seems like you want to make it a year or 2 at the most. That's just my off the cuff answer for that. Other thoughts?
I don't know. It's the house is there to begin with, the old house. A new house gets built, then it's kind of like Gail was saying, what do? You just put a sign on the old house saying it's an ADU now. What's the difference? I'm not sure that how quickly you do it. I would hate to think that we just end up with a lot of old abandoned houses that become rodent infested out there. But if it were occupied, then I guess it has to be qualified as an ADU. It has to have a permit or whatever to allow for that. But I don't really see a time limit on this so much as just avoiding empty, abandoned places. I wouldn't want to allow that to go on, unless they were historic and turned into some kind of a monument or a neighborhood feature for historic purposes. So it's kind of nebulous to me.
Maybe put in my suggestion that we do. I mean, I personally think that we should have. I mean, if the whole, this whole bill is predicated on having expanded, having 2 potential houses to provide additional housing. You don't want somebody to just build one and then leave the other. You want to have, yeah. So it looks like we lost Commissioner Orr, but Commissioner Kwong, do you have an opinion on this?
I guess my question is, okay, if the person built a new house and this old unit house is going to be converted, wouldn't they have to have applied for permit to turn it into an ADU? And that permit process, doesn't that have a time limit to as in code to do this already? And if it was me, and I guess it's kind of depending on the fund, but I would want to get this done fairly quickly to convert this into an ADU, and then, but you know, with I don't know, with a year, 2 years, like you said. I guess that's a question to Director Hendrickson. If that's, I mean, once they built the house, then, and when they applied for an ADU unit, wouldn't that be a time limit that they have to build it on? Oops. Director Henderson, I guess my question is, when someone builds a home on that has historic structures there, and when they apply for an ADU, wouldn't that be there's a time limit where they can have to finish the project?
You don't necessarily, if you're, they would apply for a permit to build the new house, but I'm not really clear about what, we wouldn't necessarily issue a permit to say that the historic home is now an ADU. The only reason they would have permits for the ADU is if they were making some sort of alteration to it or something like that. So, I mean, this provision in the House bill is actually a little unclear to me, because a house is a house, and I don't know what would distinguish the historic home from an ADU. I just don't understand the difference. So to me, it's unclear, but I don't think I quite answered your question.
I'm going to suggest we just move on from this one and we come back to it. Maybe if we do end up moving forward with some of this House Bill 3012, we can get some background and better understanding it. So the next section 5, we've already answered, I think, 2 acres and yes, until Clatsup Plains is better understood. And the next one that we're looking at is number 7, the bottom of page 44. The county may require a new single-family dwelling to be serviced by the same water supply. So here you have a property that's more than 2 acres. It now has 2 houses on it. One of them is an accessory dwelling. Should they be required to be on the same water source as, should they be required to either it's probably going to be a well or surface water system or individual. Thoughts on that?
It could also be a water district. We do have a lot of water districts, Napa, Wickiup, some other ones.
Right, yeah, thank you. Commissioner Farrar.
Yeah, I kind of puzzled over this one a little bit myself. I don't really think there's a reason that the ADU couldn't be on a different water system if that were available to them. Out here, I'm at my country place, in quotes, on John Day River Road, and we're in the Fern Hill water district here, community water system, actually. It's not a water district. And it's privately owned, and it's not that easy to get a meter because the system has a limit to what it can supply. But if somebody wanted an ADU out here and drilled a well that was sufficient to serve the needs of that, I don't see any reason they should not be able to do that. So I would be in favor of not having that restriction, really.
I agree, Commissioners Kwong and Orr.
Same, I agree.
Unmute me. Okay, I'm unmuted. Yes, I'll go along with the group on that.
Okay, and then do you think that one parking space is sufficient, or should that be increased or eliminated?
That's a tough one. I hope I'm not speaking out of turn. That one I've definitely flagged. The realities of increased population density, the realities of high rents. Harkens back to my days when I had 3 or 4 or even 5 roommates. That was the way we got around the inability to pay rent, like when I was a college student or a starving musician. That experience of mine would argue, and also the situation that confronts us now with wages by and large being insufficient to house the people that need it, many of the people that need it, that would argue for more parking spaces. That would help because they have to drive because it is rural. You could have 2 parking spaces for a husband and a wife. You got a husband and a wife and a kid living at home. That's 3 parking spaces. So I don't know that. I'd like to hear what others have to say.
Just remember, these are properties that are 2 acres or more, and so like, is there, it's like not even suburban, it's like exurban. So, so you have like parking spaces like in front of the place, but then there's also usually driveways and roads and all sorts of other places that are off, technically, not the official parking spot for that ADU that they could potentially park at. So that's what I think about, is I'm thinking like, this is not a city that we're talking about. So, my first swipe is 1 is fine because there's other places to park. But Commissioner Kwong.
Yeah, this seems to me like this is a requirement to go with the ADU. It's not a maximum. Well, it was just the question is like, is it do we add to the code that the ADU require 1 parking spot, or it can be eliminated as a requirement, not a maximum. But although maximum may be good.
Well, should it be increased is the question that's posed as a discussion item. And I'm leaning in the direction that it should be increased because of the point made by Chair Gardner that these are rural areas and the crowding off street, the lack of off street parking, or the crowding of the street itself when there's over parking going on don't seem to apply. So I would say 2 or 3, but certainly it should be studied and debated, properly.
Commissioner Farrar.
I'm pretty big on parking. I don't like vehicles that occupy the edge of a roadway on a narrow road or occupy a footpath that pedestrians use. So I would like a parking requirement for ADUs. It should be pretty easy on a 2-acre parcel, but there may be certain situations where there are reasons that it isn't so good, or maybe they want to keep vegetation heavy and just push the parking out on the highway. So I would go for something that required 1 parking space for maybe 400 square feet or less. And if you're going over 400 square feet, then maybe 2 spaces, or, there's a limitation on 900 square feet, I think. So maybe just one space for small ones and two for large would cover it, because how many people are going to occupy the place?
That's a good compromise. Because I will say, like, I mean, I think 900 square feet is definitely very different than 500 or 600. So you might end up with a small family even with the 900 square foot one. So if you have a differentiated depending on the size, that makes sense to me. How about ADUs? Should they be allowed to have garages and or outbuildings? Commissioner Farrar.
I considered that one and thought that, that should be okay if it doesn't interfere with or doesn't exceed the permitted lot coverages. I don't see anything wrong with a storage shed, walk-in kind of storage shed next to it. Just make it more useful to the occupant. And garages are great for extending the life of your vehicle and keeping unsightly stuff out of view.
I wish I had one. What about though, like, so 900 square feet plus a garage. So that's significantly different than, then you're getting into house territory, right?
Well, 2 acres is something like 84,000 square feet. So not particularly huge, but it's pretty big compared to urban lots where a lot of people are calling for, let's pack more houses in on that little 50 by 100 foot lot. And I think there's a lot more flexibility on the properties we're talking about.
Yes, Commissioner Orr.
I'll keep it brief. The concern on the honor and the operation success of an honor system, I want to first state the self-reliance and in rural areas and the home businesses and the remote thing all favor generous provisions regarding outbuildings and garages. But I also have concerns of the honor system where you say you have an ADU and next thing you know, you got a garage full of people and outbuildings full of people. And that puts stresses that were not contemplated or intended with this new ADU legislation. So that would argue for a public hearing, so we could just see who's applying and get a sense of it and put the neighbors fair notice. Thanks.
Commissioner Kwong, do you have an opinion on this? Oh, I'm sorry. Let's go back to Director Henriksen first.
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to point out in response to Commissioner Orr's comments that the same thing could happen with just a plain old single-family residential unit, and those are not required to go to a public hearing in these zones. So, it can happen with any type of use that's approved, regardless of how you approve it, that people will sometimes do things that they're not permitted to do.
Very true. Very true.
And my only point would be that there ought to be at least some check and balance by having the public involved. Whereas if it's a outright permitted use for single residential and people want to run past it, that's one thing. It's harder to control. There is some access and control to it, however, inherent, at least from my perspective, in a public hearing with neighbors being able to watch things and regulate them like they did in Gearhart.
Commissioner Kwong?
Well, I agree that we do need to have some sort of outbuilding, especially when it's in a small space and you're living there on a long-term basis. I know that I do accumulate stuff, and everybody else do. I think that an outbuilding is definitely a need for a unit like that. my other thing is like I have to go soon. I hate to do this. I hope this hasn't changed the meeting because of the quorum. I didn't. Yeah, I didn't. I guess I didn't anticipate that the meeting to this is a likely process still, and it still goes quite a bit to go. I don't know how.
Thank you, Commissioner Kwong. I think we're okay because this is not a public hearing. It's just a work session. So we're just kind of getting some initial feedback. If you have additional feedback on other sections, I encourage you to just write an email to Director Henriksen with some of your thoughts and copy me.
Okay.
And then we're going to come back around to this. Don't you worry.
Yeah. Okay.
So, all right. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Bye.
Am I right, Director Henriksen, that we can keep moving forward? Okay. All right. So, well, for this one, I'd like to note that the commissioners are split on the answer to this one. I do not believe that the ADU should be allowed to have garages or outbuildings because, you know, we're talking about ADUs. We're not talking about adding another house. And I feel like it's a slippery slope. You know, this is a very specific thing that we're talking about doing, you know, adding a very, you know, a small unit that would ideally be used for as a long-term rental for some of our workers. We're not talking about, you know, allowing additional houses on 2 acres. And I think if we're having that conversation, that's a different conversation. So I think we're trying to find, and I think if you add, especially a garage, you would significantly increase the cost of building it and also the rent. So for those reasons, I would be opposed to the outbuildings and garages thing. As much as I love a garage, living in a coastal place where my car is resting out. But are there other conditions of approval that should be required? Commissioner Farrar, do you have any ideas about that? We had already talked about some around hazard areas. I had mentioned a concern around roads, but I don't know how to. So if we're increasing density in particular areas, how do we, you know, answer the question around whether they're county, public, or private roads and maintenance and how that all plays together?
Yeah, I don't have anything else to add other than my feeling that the hazard zones would be good to stay out of. But I have kind of a nagging question in my head that I don't know if Director Henriksen can address this or not. In terms of who builds the ADU, would it be possible for a property owner that meets all the criteria necessary to allow one to just make an arrangement with a contractor to come and build a place, an ADU, and then the contractor essentially runs it as a business? In other words, they go around building ADUs and on willing property owners' land and maybe give them a percentage, but they ultimately are the ones renting the units out. Is that allowable, or does that turn it into some kind of a business that's not allowed in that zone?
That's an interesting question, and I don't know the answer. And County Council, I think, has left our meeting. So I would have to do some more research on that.
Yeah, I'm not completely opposed to that kind of a concept. It might be a way around this high cost of building small houses that have too many amenities. You get somebody in there that does the building and works out a business plan and maybe builds 6, 8, 10 of these things in some area, all similar, on land that they don't have to buy, and maybe they can do it at a fairly affordable price then and actually get somewhere with it. But there could be problems, and I just think it's something that people might consider and discuss the pros and cons of at some point.
Yeah, so typically, a local government doesn't necessarily regulate ownership. So I can't tell you that you have to own the house you live in, or that you cannot long-term rent out the house that you own. So I don't know that there would be a prohibition against someone owning separately the building itself. What could not happen is that they couldn't split in terms of ownership and split the property apart to say, now I own the land and the ADU, and this is my parcel, and you own the house and your land, and that's your parcel. They couldn't do that. But I don't know that there would be anything to prohibit someone from actually just selling the unit off, because it would be no different than if you were to rent it long term. You basically, you own it, but you really don't own it because you don't have the right to use it freely because it's rented to someone else who holds those rights. So we'll check with county council, but that's my initial thought.
Thanks for that info. You're on mute.
I talked a lot too. Sorry about that. So moving on to Senate Bill 391. I think some of these questions we've already answered, but should be similar to the last one. So under number 1, I think we've already answered that we think there's plenty of properties currently that would allow ADUs, and we don't need to utilize additional exceptions. And then number 2, I think we were in agreement that 2-acre lot size is a fine minimum lot size, and Clatsup lanes and geographic areas. Moving on to the next page. Okay, so this is a new one. Under number 4, it's about problematic properties. Should property owners who have open code violations be allowed to construct an ADU on their property, even if the code violation remains unresolved? Can you give some background on this one, Director Hendrickson?
Yeah, so the Senate Bill 391 is very clear that if you have a certain type of subject nuisance property, which is, I think that some of the uses they call out in ORS are brothels, houses where drugs are sold or manufactured, and kind of chronic criminal properties like that, that they are not eligible for an ADU, but it doesn't really discuss, smaller violations at a local level. So for example, if I have a code violation because I built a deck without a permit, or I have a code violation because I have someone living in an RV on my property for more than 30 days out of a 90-day period, or I have a code violation because the people in my RV are dumping raw sewage on the ground, should properties that have local open code violations be allowed to construct an ADU? And typically we would not issue a permit unless it was something to correct a violation. But I just wanted to kind of run this one by you and see what your thoughts were.
Commissioner Farrar?
Well, I'd be clearly against letting them build an ADU until they corrected the issues that they're in violation of. This is a chance to use a carrot and stick approach to try to get somebody to comply a little bit more fully on things that really matter for public health and aesthetics. So I'd like to see them have to be clearly in conformance on everything else before they're given an ADU permit.
I agree.
I agree. I'd like to see the specific list of nuisances when it comes back to us, just to better understand them. Okay, so we have a current rule in the books that our ADUs can't be more than 75% of the size of the original unit house, or 900 square feet, whichever is less, right? And so the question here is, should that be revised to just say up to 900 square feet? What do you think, Commissioner Farrar?
Well, I kind of go with this idea of what size property is it going on. You know, maybe if it's a larger property, then you could come up with something based around total lot coverage and allow it to be 900 feet or even larger. If you're talking about a 5-acre piece, I don't really see a problem with them having a 1,200 square foot place on it as an ADU. But a smaller property, I think it's good to have a limit.
Commissioner Ward, do you have an opinion on this?
I don't have any strong feelings. I would defer to planning staff's recommendations on that.
I'm just picturing like a McMansion and how big that could result in the ADU being. And if our goal is to have like kind of little units that are less expensive, again, not adding additional houses, but just ADUs, I kind of feel like they should be small. So if you have like a 5,000 square foot house.
No,
Anyway.
even if you had 5,000 square feet, you'd still be capped at a 900 square foot ADU.
Oh, okay. All right. So then it's the 75% limitation. So under this law, you have to do that. Is that right? Is that right?
You don't have to build to 900 square feet, but that's the maximum you can build.
Maximum, right. Okay. All right. I like that. I feel like ADUs should be small. That's my view. So, okay. What's next?
So I just want to be clear that if I understood, do we just want to leave our language the way it's currently worded? Or just go at 900 square feet? I wasn't very clear on the direction.
Well, if we were going to go under this, we would be required to get rid of the 75%. Is that right? Under this law?
Well, we don't know, because our code reads 75% or 900 square feet, whichever is less. So either way, you're capped at 900, but we have this 75% language in there.
Oh, so like if the house.
So if you had a smaller house and your 75% only came out to 750 square feet, you'd be capped at that instead of 900 square feet. So that would be the difference.
If you had a 900 square foot house, if we changed it, then effectively you could have another 900 square foot house.
Correct.
So if the intention is to have an ADU and not an additional house, then I think we should keep our 75%. That's my view.
I can agree with that, but I still think on a very large property, if that were to come up, it seems reasonable to allow it to be larger. It wouldn't really crowd things, and people would look at it and think that the big house was not the ADU, but in fact maybe it was. And it's just a name game. But I don't want to see neighborhoods change vastly by making them oppressively overbuilt. So I'm not in favor of huge lot coverages, but where the lots are large, I think there might be room for more flexibility on the actual footprint.
Okay, so I'm hearing we're flexible on this one, Commissioner Henriksen, so you can bring back your recommendation.
Okay.
Number 7, so they're required to be within 100 feet from the existing single-family dwelling. So staff is asking us, how should that be measured? Like, so the idea is that they could be within or next to or 100 feet away if they're like a kind of cottage style ADU. So, depending on how you measure it, it'd be more or less restrictive. So you can see the 3 options there. The entire footprint has to be within 100 feet, 50% of the footprint or the closest point of the ADU cannot be more than 100 feet. Opinions on that? I kind of feel like it's 2 acres. It shouldn't matter too much. So I kind of would be the least restrictive. I would probably just go for the closest point or whatever's easiest for staff to measure. Because
I don't know. For me, oddly enough, I went the other way on this. I thought, yeah, you allowed another little dwelling on there. Put it close up to the existing dwelling. Don't have the new little place right out on the corner of the property and the old original house somewhere else. I wanted it all within 100 feet, the whole thing, first choice. But I get your point. There's all kinds of different properties and different situations arise. So
there's also like, where's the septic system going to be? Like maybe be in between. I don't know. But 100 feet is it's a city lot. You can picture it, 50 by 100. But Commissioner Orr, do you have a strong opinion on this or?
I'm afraid not.
Okay, I think we can go forward, Commissioner Henriksen, with what you want to recommend. I think for that one, we're flexible on it. Okay, now we get to skip to the bottom of 48. So, there are setbacks from resource land, so forestry and farmlands, I believe is what we're talking about here. So, and those are intended to reduce conflict, though of course 50 feet is not that far. So Clatsop County currently has a 50-foot minimum setback from resource zones. Is that adequate for this thing? So ADUs, should there be additional setbacks or should we keep it the same? And this may change. I mean, it feels like over time for everybody, if we, in the face of climate change and increased fire risk in particular, that that other bill comes into effect. If people are, for example, adjacent to a forest that's prone to fires, we may end up with increased setbacks like requirements at that time. Correct, Director Henriksen?
I don't know that it would necessarily be increased setbacks, but I think what we might see are larger cleared areas and defensible spaces and fuel breaks around structures that are in close proximity to wildfire areas. But I don't know that anything would come from the state necessarily about requiring buildings to be further away from a property line.
So the question today is should we make it different? Like currently it's 50 feet. I feel like if we're going to change 50 feet, we should change it for everything, not just for ADUs. What do you think, Commissioner Farrar and Commissioner Orr?
I was okay with the 50 foot, but I agree that things could be different with the urban forest kind of interface issues, and at some point we might want to revisit that. But for a starting point, it seems like 50 feet's a good number.
All right, number 14, should the county require a restrictive covenant that would prohibit the ADU from being used as a short-term rental?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, that was easy. Number 16, we're back to the water supply source, and we've already answered that question. And then we also answered the question around parking and garages and conditions of approval. So now we're down at additional discussion items. All right, so this is back to the question around what's the appropriate level of review. Director Henriksen, could you explain the fees, like the different fees around conditional use 1, 2, and 2A?
Yeah, so a type 1 development permit is currently $85. Conditional use type 2 is $1,200, and then a type 2A, which goes to the public hearing, is $1,500. Usually with a development permit, we don't see that people hire land use consultants or attorneys to submit or walk the development permit through the approval process. Sometimes you may see that when you get to a conditional use or to a public hearing, that people will then have to or need to hire a land use consultant or attorney to assist them, because as we all know, the rules are pretty complex and state statute is complex and our codes are complex, and sometimes for the average lay person coming in, they need that additional professional assistance. So that would be an increased cost above and beyond their permit application fee.
So type 1's very cheap. Not much difference actually between type 2 and type 3 in the grand scheme of things. I think like in my experience, limited experience, but my friends who've built ADUs, they can be, if you do a detached ADU, they can be $100,000, $150,000 to build at minimum. So that's not a lot in the grand scheme of things, the permit fees. Yes, Director Henriksen.
Yeah, I just have a question for you, Chair Gardner. Is a lot, or do you know what percentage of that cost is actually system development charges that they're paying
without system development charges? I think that's without system development charges. That's just building it. Well, that's a good question. Actually, that's a good question. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if that includes like permits and everything together, but just in anecdotal conversations I've had with people who have done them, they've, and they always are more than you think they're going to be, is what I often hear from them, is that, but those are the detached ones. That's why I'm actually a big fan of the not detached ones for a variety of reasons, like doing them in the basement or adjacent or part of a home is a lot less expensive and can provide as much housing depending on how your house is set up. Because then you don't have to do as much of that separate stuff. But okay, so then the question here. So we're trying to add housing, where it's appropriate, at a help it. So we don't want to make it like overly expensive, overly burdensome. But at the same time, we have to recognize that neighbors want to know when this stuff is happening. And it's hard to know if you don't go through that type 2A hearing process. And then there's all these subtleties in different areas of the county. Like when I was talking to Charles, Charles will be relieved to hear the 2 acre minimum, because I think that will preclude a lot of this happening in Falcon Cove Beach. But there's places all over the county that just have their own little quirks that neighbors want to be able to at least know it's happening and be able to say, like, this is a problem, how are we going to fix this, and work with county staff and the applicant to make sure that those interests are addressed. So how do we balance those things?
I have an idea. We should lean in favor of public notice because they are affecting the quality, the character of neighborhoods and of communities. They are hard to get rid of once they're there. And the experience of communities that have short-term rentals, if that's any indication of what can go wrong, I think strongly encourages a full public hearing. If the only difference is a couple $300 and some paperwork, I think we owe it to our neighbors to be protective of the quality of life as it exists prior to such change.
Well, I'm also in favor of public notice and probably public hearing. I don't know if there's a constraint on the county to hold the permit responsible for a type 2, and if nobody that's noticed wants a hearing, then you just forego the hearing. Is that a possibility?
Yeah, we do have language in the code that gives the director the ability to elevate something from a 2 to a 2A, so to go from just public notice to public notice and hearing. So that could occur, but it would be at the director's discretion.
It just seems like if you put out a notice and nobody comes, then you don't have a hearing, And I guess maybe it's no big deal, except we all have to meet, and that takes a certain amount of time and so on. But it just seems like you could jump ahead and say, hey, we're putting out the notice. If you notify us that you want a hearing, then we'll have a hearing. If we don't hear from you, then there's not going to be a hearing. But I'm in favor of the public getting involved because I know I may be kind of overly optimistic here, but I think that the public can really help by bringing up points that may not have been considered. I mean, they live right nearby, maybe they live next door and they know about something that's kind of unique to the situation. So we benefit from hearing from the public, and I wish we heard from the public a whole lot more, but that's just me.
Director Henriksen.
Yeah, I just want to point out, not advocating necessarily for one position or another, but with a type 2, the same group of people within the same notification area are going to get a notice. And with the type 2, people can return comments to staff that are included in the staff report. So it's not as if they're denied an opportunity to provide comments if it's a type 2 and does not go to a public hearing versus going to a public hearing. Also, I would point out that with Commissioner Farrar's suggestion, I think that adds a level of uncertainty to the process, because now someone doesn't know if their approval is going to take X number of days because it's just a 10-day public comment period and then staff writes the decision, or if I have to wait 10 days and then I find out if I'm going to go to a hearing, and then it's going to take, depending on when an application is submitted, it could take up to 2 months to get it scheduled for a public hearing. So that does add an element of uncertainty to that whole process.
I wish
Yeah,
Commissioner
understand
Johnson
your
was
point.
here for this conversation, because I'm sure
Okay,
he would
well,
have insight.
let me just thank Gail for bringing that point up, because I get that point. I can see why it's done the way it is.
I think I would start with a conditional 2A, and if over time it's seen as something that's not controversial, that we don't have issues with, then it can be loosened over time. But it's harder to me to tighten things than to loosen things. And I mean, I'm always for more public involvement in actual public hearing versus like writing an email into staff and nobody ever seeing it outside of that person. I think I would start with that more restrictive and see how it goes the first 3 to 5 years, and then dial it back. I want to point to, I was just looking at this summary report, housing summaries report, and that there's a push pull around making permitting more complicated, but then there's always opportunity to actually add incentives, especially if there are pledges to for these ADUs to become long-term rentals. I know in Portland they did a program where they waived permit fees for and different charges for a certain period of time if actually they waived them completely if the people pledged to house a homeless family for I think 10 years. And they this was like a test program and they got snatched up like that. Like they all did it. Like, and so they are, I don't know how that program is moving forward, but I think we should look at special programs and incentives to encourage these development, but encourage the development of rental housing, make sure that as things are built, they don't end up being extensions of vacation homes, short-term rentals, or just not being available as housing. Because the intention of all this work is to provide that very missing workforce housing that we need in the long term. So, Director Hendrickson, have you gotten all the feedback you need on this agenda item?
I did have one more question. So as staff had envisioned this, and as we talked about in our presentation, our next step was to take your recommendations from today and schedule this item for a work session with the Board of Commissioners. But during our discussions, Chair Gardner, I heard you say that you wanted staff to bring recommendations back to the Planning Commission. So I just want to be clear about what you are expecting to see back from staff and if you want to see that before we schedule this for a Board of Commissioners work session.
I think I was envisioning when we, if we, both the County Commission and the Planning Commission, are in agreement, we want to pursue some of this work, and also on the previous ADU rules, then we work specifically on the ordinances and we look at these options when we're doing that. So I think later is what I had envisioned. Do you have different feelings, Commissioner Farrar or?
No, that sounds very reasonable.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, that was a bit of a slog, but we made it. So we're gonna wrap up the meeting here. We've got a project status report, which is page 53 of your packets. It looks like the meteorological tower was completed on the potential wind farm property. Is there any other questions for Director Hendrickson on the project status report?
A question, but I'm happy to see that some of these goals are getting agreed upon to be sent on up to the Board of Commissioners. That's real progress, so that's encouraging to see.
All right, the director's report. Director Hendrickson, would you please give your report?
Yeah, so we do have the joint meeting with the Board of Commissioners on January 19th. That's a Wednesday, and that will be 10 o'clock. That's a virtual meeting. And that will, I don't think that agenda has been published yet. So as soon as it is, I will send that out to you. We are looking possibly at putting goals 16, 17, and 18, which are estuarine resources, coastal shorelands, and beaches and dunes. We're looking at doing a request for proposals for a consultant to update those. It's not been finalized yet, and an RFP has not been issued, but that seems to be the way where we might be leaning. We're also looking at working with Oregon's Kitchen Table to do some public outreach on the comprehensive plan update. That's the same organization that handled the redistricting input that the county recently went through in terms of redrawing the district maps. Let's see. I think those are the highlights of everything for now. And our next joint meeting with the Countywide Citizen Advisory Committee will be in a couple of weeks on January 25th.
Thank you. You had mentioned the planning commission appointments, you know, us having the discussion on the 19th, which is pretty soon, but I remember from the work session where they talked about that the Board of Commissioners was interested in meeting with the applicants. Is that put off? Or is that also
Yeah,
happening?
so the board wanted to wait until the redistricting process was complete, and that will theoretically be done on January 12th with the second reading of the ordinance. And then the board also wanted to schedule some sort of meeting or meet and greet with the Planning Commission applicants so that everybody could be introduced to one another. That has not been scheduled yet, and I do not have a date for when that might happen. And so that is one of our 4 topics that we'll be covering with the board at our joint meeting on the 19th. We'll be talking about the Planning Commission appointments, the strategic plan update, and the role that the Planning Commission will play in that process. We're talking about the comp plan update process in general and the Planning Commission bylaws.
Great, thank you. All right. We don't have this on our agenda, but we usually do. Do we have any good of the order? Do planning commissioners have anything relevant to Clatsop County or the Planning Commission that they'd like to report? All right. I'll just note that, of course, because I have to say it, COVID-19 cases are up and it's spreading rapidly throughout our communities. I think Oregon is at 20% infection rate at this point. So stay safe out there, make sure you get your boosters, and hopefully we'll get out of this sooner than later. So any other additional comments before we adjourn? Hearing none, the meeting is adjourned. Thank you.